I'm oral historian Mike Chappell. Today, June 11, 2009, I'm interviewing Dr. J. Lester Gabrilove for the Endocrine Society at its annual meeting being held this year at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Gabrilove has been a pioneer in the field of endocrinology for more than 60 years. His research has provided new insights into feminizing and virilizing disorders of the adrenal gland and gonads, gynecomastia, Cushing's syndrome, thyroid toxicosis, and the medical treatment of prostatic hyperplasia. Dr. Gabrilove co-founded the Endocrine Clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital in 1952. 55 years later, in 2007, Mount Sinai formally renamed its endocrine division the Hilda and J. Lester Gabrilove, M.D., Division of Endocrinology, Diabetes, and Bone Diseases, in honor of Dr. Gabrilove and his wife, Hilda. Currently, Dr. Gabrilove is the Florence and Theodore Baumritter Professor of Medicine, Emeritus, at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Dr. Gabrilove, would you please tell me a little bit about your family background, starting with your grandparents?
Well, I only knew my grandmother, who lived with us for a short number of years, and then she died. But my other grandparents had died before I was born.
Where were your parents born, and what kind of education did they have?
My parents were both born in Russia and came to the United States at about the age of 2. So for practical purposes, they were American most of their lives.
Do you know why they came from Russia?
I guess most people left Russia because it wasn't so comfortable for them.
What did your mother and father do for a living when you were growing up?
My father was a manufacturer of men's clothing, and my mother was a housewife. In those days, women didn't work.
And what was it like growing up in the Depression in New York City?
Well, I basically didn't feel the Depression. My father was comfortable and suffered, of course, in the Depression, but they never allowed it for me to feel the effects of the Depression.
And you were living in New York City at the time, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you born there?
I was born in New York City.
Okay. Was education a priority in your family?
Yes. Both my brothers went to college. My sister went to the teacher's college. And I, of course, went through college and medical school.
What type of education did you have in high school?
Well, I went to the Townsend Harris High School. It was a preparatory school for the city college for very bright young men, and they took the 4-year course in 3 years.
Were there any teachers or other people who had a particularly strong influence on you?
No, all the people at Townsend Harris were really college instructors assigned to Townsend Harris. And there weren't any particularly that I was attracted to, but they were all very good and very supportive.
What were your favorite subjects in high school?
Well, mathematics, French, and perhaps a little history.
And what about your extracurricular activities, sports or...
Well, I was young. I graduated high school at 14 and a half, so I was playing baseball with my contemporaries at home. That was my favorite sport then.
Were you making any decisions at this point in your life about what you might want to do for a career?
Well, I don't know why, but it seemed to me I wanted to be a doctor since I was a young child. Why, I don't know. Perhaps because of the doctors I encountered, I don't know. I had been sick as a young boy. I had a mastoid at the age of 2, so that may have influenced me.
Why did you choose to go to the College of the City of New York?
Well, I was accepted to Columbia, but they told me I would have to wait a year because I was too young to go to Columbia. Well, I didn't feel like just wasting a year, and people from Townsend Harris were automatically admitted to the City College. So I went to the City College.
What was campus life like
Well, campus life didn't really exist. The City College was a very lovely campus, but it didn't have, since everybody was from the city, didn't have any really campus life.
What was your major?
My major was in biology and chemistry.
And what kind of a student were you?
I was a very good student. I graduated magna cum laude. If I'd gotten better grades in gym, I would have been summa cum laude.
Did you have any special contact with the faculty?
No, well, we didn't have, because of being a city-based college, we didn't have any extracurricular activity with the faculty. They were all very nice, but I don't remember anyone who particularly stood out in my memory.
And why did you choose for medical school? Why did you choose the New York University College of Medicine?
Well, I applied to several. I applied to Columbia and Cornell, and they didn't give me an interview. It wasn't that they had anything against me, but they didn't particularly like people from the City College, because in those days there was some talk of City College being too radical. So I was accepted at the Long Island College of Hospital and Boston University and NYU. So I chose to go to NYU. First of all, it was local, and it would save us the cost of room and board elsewhere.
And how were you supported in medical school?
By my family.
And did you have much exposure to endocrinology when you were at the medical school?
No, we had a lady named Elaine Rawley who taught us a little endocrinology. It was very little known then and very little that she taught us. It was mostly a little bit of diabetes.
And when you finished up at the medical school, how did you imagine the type of physician you might be?
Well, I didn't know. When we finished medical school, you of course applied for internship. And in those days, there was a good deal of anti-Semitism. So I didn't think I would be accepted at Cornell or Columbia, as I wouldn't have been. And I was accepted at Mount Sinai, which was the premier Jewish hospital and one of the premier hospitals in the whole country.
Was there a lot of competition to get into
Oh,
Mount
yes.
Sinai?
Everybody wanted to go to Mount Sinai.
What was it like at Mount Sinai during the war years?
Well, we weren't particularly affected by the war years, except that a lot of people were inducted during the course of their internship and went off to the Army and came back later to complete their internship. But we were able to carry on. We had sufficient staff to carry on.
Was there anything unusual about your residency? Any features that stand out?
Well, it was very enjoyable, you know. In those days, when you're an intern and you're a resident, you spent all your life at the hospital. I mean, to have a night out on the town was very, very unusual. We would date the nurses when we did go out, but we didn't. We'd work till 1 or 2 o'clock at night every night. So it was a hectic schedule and full time.
Did you become interested in salt and water metabolism at this time?
Yes, I don't remember now exactly how I became interested in salt and water metabolism. And so when I finished, Dr. Libman said to me, "Where would you like to go for postgraduate training?" Dr. Libman was a very generous man and supported a lot of Mount Sinai graduates for postgraduate education after they finished their internship or residency. And I said I was interested in salt and water metabolism. He said, "Why don't you go see Jack Peters?" So I went up to see Dr. Peters, and he interviewed me, and he took me on, and I went up there for a year. And there he was in charge of salt and water metabolism, as well as all metabolic diseases, including diabetes. So I had the exposure to all of these at that time.
Let's see, that was at Yale? Was that?
Yes.
Okay.
And,
And who was Emanuel Liebman?
Emanuel Liebman was one of the leading physicians in New York City, and he was a bachelor, and he was the uncle of Frank and George Engel, who turned out to be very fine leading physicians in the country.
And when you went to Yale, were you thinking of becoming a physician scientist at that point?
Well, I was thinking of being an academic, and when I finished at Yale, I wanted to go to Johns Hopkins. In fact, Dr. Longcope, who was chief of medicine at Johns Hopkins, had broached me before I went up to Yale about coming to Johns Hopkins. I don't know why he broached me, but he did. And I said, I'm sorry, I'd already accepted a position at Yale. Then when I was finishing at Yale, he approached me again to come to Johns Hopkins. But my brother said, enough of this academic studies, you're going to come here and be in New York, because our parents are getting older and we have to have somewhere available, because both my brothers lived out of town and just there was my sister there.
And what was John Peters like as a scientist?
Well, John Peters was one of the leading scientists in the medical field. He co-wrote Peters, A Man's Like, which was sort of a Bible to everybody in academic medicine. It was clinical biochemistry and was in 2 volumes, as I recall.
What research were you doing with Dr. Peters at Yale?
Dr. Peters, I wrote a paper on salt and water metabolism in diabetes.
Were there any diagnostic implications or therapeutic implications from that paper?
Well, it explained how the diabetic handled salt and water metabolism. So while it wasn't earth-shaking, it was published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, so it meant it was a high-caliber paper.
Other than Dr. Peters, was there anyone else at Yale who influenced your career?
No, no.
What was going on at Yale in endocrinology and diabetes at this time?
Well, nothing special, except in those days, Dr. Peters was sort of unique in that he did salt and water metabolism, as well as diabetes and endocrinology. Everything all under one hat.
Were you thinking of yourself as an endocrinologist at this point?
Well, not particularly, but when I came back, they assigned me, because of my training, to work with Dr. Louis Sofa, who was a self-trained endocrinologist, or not self-trained. He had worked at Johns Hopkins.
Now, what brought about your return to Mount Sinai? Had you agreed that you were going to return even before you went to Yale, or how did you get back there?
I told you, they offered me a job at Johns Hopkins. I would have gone there. But if not, I went back to Mount Sinai. Because as I told you, in those days, the anti-Semitism was rather rampant. So I wouldn't go to Columbia or Cornell, so I returned to Mount Sinai, which, as I told you, was one of the preeminent places in the medical world.
So those were really your only choices? It was either going to be Johns Hopkins or Mount Sinai?
Yes.
Who was the chief of medicine at Mount Sinai at this time?
Well, at that time, Eli Moshkowitz was one of the chiefs, and George Baer, who was a predominant figure in medicine, was a chief. There were 2 divisions, and Isidore Snapper was also there during the war. And those were the main chiefs. But we had a whole group of people, Reuben Ottenberg, who who was famous for his work on blood groups, David Beck, and a whole host of all the leading physicians in New York and perhaps in the country were concentrated at Mount Sinai.
And what was your first order of business or assignment?
Well, I came back, and they assigned me, as I said, to Louis Sofa because I was theoretically trained in endocrinology and metabolic diseases. And so I established a practice as was commonly done, and I worked in my practice half-time, or even less, and in my research the other half-time.
And how soon after your return did you become liaison between endocrinology and diabetes?
Well, when I returned, they made me the liaison. So I worked in diabetes and in endocrinology.
And what were your duties as liaison?
Just to work on both of them. I didn't have any particular duties.
Okay. And who assigned you to that?
The chief of medicine then. I guess may have been George Baer then.
And what was the status of endocrinology at Mount Sinai at this time?
Was barely existing there. I mean, although there are a lot of things that had been done at Mount Sinai. Saul Silver and B.S. Oppenheimer had described Cushing's syndrome in detail a number of years ago. And investigators at Mount Sinai did various things in thyroid. Arthur Sovell had done, and Freddie King had done some work on thyroid. So there was no specialization in it then, but people were doing work in endocrinology.
And you said your day was organized between private practice and research?
Right.
And would you say again how much time you spent?
Yes. Well, when I came back, I was given a fellowship for 3 years. So I was the fellow at Yale and then the 3 years at Mount Sinai. But they allowed me to practice. I didn't have much of a practice, but I did that. And the rest of the time, I did whatever research I was going to do.
How did you get your patients?
I don't know. Well, interestingly enough, in those days, the physicians who were high in the echelons, George Baer and David Beck and Reuben Ottenberg, etc., had private practices. They all had private practices. And when they went away or went on vacation or a meeting, they need somebody to cover them. I was the lateral. I covered for all of them. So that's how I ultimately got patients, because when they stopped practicing, they turned their patients over to me. Apparently they were pleased with my performance.
Now, how did the endocrine clinic or endocrine division come about in 1952?
Well, when the Department of Medicine was reorganized in 1952, it was organized along university model, and with the medicine and its subgroups, gastroenterology, endocrinology, etc. And endocrinology was set up then.
And would you sketch out?
Dr. Alexander Gutman had been imported from Columbia to head the Department of Medicine at Mount Sinai.
And would you sketch out the endocrine clinic for me?
Well, the endocrine clinic was a small clinic. Patients were referred to us with endocrine diseases, and we would investigate them and treat them. And then, very, very interesting, we'd write them up.
And who worked in the endocrine clinic along with you?
I did. I'm trying to think, was anybody there? I don't know. I think it was Sofa and myself, but I did all the work. It was a different era.
It was you and Dr. Sofer?
Yes.
And
And then the diabetes was separate from there. And there was a gentleman, Herbert Pollack, who was there and he was chief of diabetes. And then he left to go to Virginia, and Henry Dulger succeeded him. And I was the liaison between the two divisions, endocrinology and diabetes. And Henry Dulger became a good friend of mine, too.
Okay. I'd like to ask a little bit about the research that you were doing at that time. How did you come to choose your research projects?
Well, something would come up when it required an answer. I would attack it then, and that's how, and then one led to another. And then in the early 50s, Dr. Sofa, who had written a book on the human adrenal, decided he would like to write one on endocrinology, and he asked me to co-write it with him. So I sat up all nights writing out this. I would read all the articles, write up the thing, then go over it with him, and he would correct the English in it, and then ultimately we published this book. It was a textbook of endocrinology. It also had a chapter on diabetes by Henry Dulger and one on reproductive disorders by Arthur Sovell. Arthur Sovell was a very good friend of mine. And he was also shared an office with Louis Sofa till they came to the parting of the ways. Arthur Sovell never told me what it was, but he never spoke to Sofa again.
You did early studies on the thyroid.
Yes.
What drew you to the thyroid?
I don't remember now, but something probably came up.
A patient?
A patient or some problem that arose on the thyroid. What was the title of the...
Well, in 1945, you did a paper with Dr. Sofer and Morley Kurt.
Morley Kurt. Oh, yes. I was resident in medicine then. And introduction of the thiouracil drug. There was one paper published, and I saw it. I said, I went to my attendings, said, can we have permission to study this? And so we did. There were two medical divisions. One, Morley Kurt was the resident, and I was the resident on the other. So we gathered whatever thyroid patients we could get, we studied them and reported them. And it was, I guess, the second or third paper on the use of the thiourea derivatives in hypothyroidism.
And do you remember what the results were?
The results were very good. It was, I think, the second paper was confirmatory of Dr. Astwood's original paper on that. So it was quite significant.
And then in 1947, you published a paper with Dr. Sofer and others, Effect of Iodine and Adrenaline on Thyrotropin in Graves' disease and in normal thyroidectomized dogs.
Well, it was derived from the fact that iodine was used in the treatment of thyrotoxicosis. We really didn't know what the mechanism was, and somehow we got onto this project. I got onto this project, and we did this study.
Okay. Would you talk a little bit about your early work on the interrelationship between the adrenals and the thyroid? And I could quote a paper title if you would like, if that would help.
Yeah, would you give me the titles?
Inhibition of thyrotropin secretion by adrenocorticocaptin in prothyrouracil-treated rats.
Yeah, well, I guess that was the crux, the inhibition. Somehow I got onto that there was an inhibition, and I was trying to delineate what the mechanism was.
But you were very interested in the interrelationship between the adrenals and...
Yes, at that time, yes. Okay. At that time, I was interested both in the thyroid and the adrenal. What happens is the separation when a little later in my career, there was Dr. Saul Silver was there, who was a very smart fellow. And when Dr. Baer divided up the pie in the medical division, he decided that Saul Silver, who was interested in the thyroid, would get the thyroid patients. So my interest in the thyroid was taken away from me, and I was left with the adrenal.
How did you feel about that?
Well, I didn't feel particularly good about it, but what you make the best of what you have. And I figured, so what? So I'll investigate the adrenal. It doesn't make any difference to me.
Would you talk a little bit about your role in bringing radioactive iodine to Mount Sinai?
Oh, yes. I was reading up in a fellow named Seidlin at Montefiore wrote a paper about the use of radioactive iodine in treating thyroid. So I went to Dr. Baer, and he assigned Dr. Silver and Sofa and myself as I was the worker. They were the supervisors. And so I arranged, I remember, I forget how I went. I went down and got radioactive iodine, and we started to study it and do it. And then Dr. Baer assigned, as I said, the use of radioactive iodine to Saul Silver and took it away from us. But I introduced the use of radioactive iodine to Mount Sinai. And in those days, there was a great hierarchy. The lower people didn't tell the older people what to do the way they do now.
What was the general morale at Mount Sinai then?
The morale was good because everybody accepted it. Didn't like it, but I accepted it.
Did you consider going to any place else?
Not at that time.
Okay, so I was going to ask you what drew you to the adrenals, but you already answered that. You were assigned to the adrenals. Yes. Okay. What kind of results did you have with compounds you tested in adrenals and in adrenal disorders? For example, in 1958, you did a study, adrenal responsiveness to corticotrophin stimulation following prednisone in normal subjects and patients treated with treated and untreated Cushing's syndrome. So that was corticotropin.
I'm sorry, I didn't get...
Okay, adrenal responsiveness to corticotropin.
Yes.
Stimulation following prednisone in normal subjects and patients with treated and untreated Cushing's syndrome.
Well, that's a complicated one. I'll have to pass on that one.
Okay. Let's see. In the late 1940s and early 50s, you did adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, ACTH on thymic mass.
Yes. Well, in that time, there was a conference on ACTH, and I got them to send me to this conference, and they have leading investigators from all over the country who were interested in ACTH. It was really isolated and purified, and so I came back with this idea of using it, and that's how I got interested in carrying out this project.
And how did your use of it go?
Well, it did what I expected it would do, and we wrote it up.
Who were your main collaborators on that, do you recall?
It was hard to tell. I did all the work. But whoever we put on the paper were the collaborators.
In 1972, you co-authored a historical vignette with Bernard Simon.
Oh, yes.
on the early investigations of dehydroxycorticosteroid
Desoxycorticosteroid, yes.
in Addison's disease?
Yes. Well, Bernie Simon had been a student at Columbia, and he was in an anti-war demonstration, so they threw him out. So he was immediately accepted at Johns Hopkins, and there he was a classmate of the Frank and George Engel, who were nephews of Emanuel Libman. And at that time, George Thorne was a relatively minor investigator at Johns Hopkins when the chief investigator left because of, I forget what the problem was. He had some problems there. So George Thorne was promoted. And then George Engel, who was the brother of Frank and George Engel, one of the Engel, I forget his first name, came from Europe, and they asked him, what is this thing you have? He says, it's a new compound called desoxycorticosterone. So George Thorne was there. They said, well, let's see what it does. So George Thorne started investigations. George Thorne was a nobody, but he was the only one there in the division. So he took it and showed what desoxycorticosterone did in Addison's disease, and it made his reputation. And a couple of years later, he was appointed the Hersey Professor of Physics at Harvard, purely serendipitously.
Now, was your contribution in that, did you work with deoxycorticosterone? Or
Yes, deoxycorticosterone was the treatment of choice in patients with Addison's disease because we didn't have glucocorticoids, cortisol, till the early 50s. And so I was using desoxycorticosterone. That was the way we treated patients with Addison's disease, but it only treated their salt wasting, which was an important consideration. When we got cortisol, we treated both their glucocorticoid insufficiency as well as their sodium problem.
And were those clinical trials that you were doing, or that was actually just treating the patients?
Well, we treated patients, but did it as clinical trials as well. We combined our research with our medical treatment. We were clinical investigators.
You gave a lecture on the virilizing syndrome in man in 1951. What drew you to problems such as virilizing adrenocortical adenomas, feminization, and gynecomastia?
Well, I encountered patients with feminization, and when I investigated it, find that they had adrenal tumors, and then there was known that they could cause virilization as well as feminization. So I looked into everything and wrote what was the definitive paper on feminizing adrenal cortical tumors. To this day, I think it's still the classical paper on the field.
And did you continue in that area?
Well, I continued in the adrenal then and investigated virilizing syndromes, feminizing syndromes, Addison's disease, Cushing's syndrome, everything about the adrenal. I wiped it clean.
What drew you to benign prostatic hypertrophy?
I don't remember what it was but anyway, I think it was the gonadotropin suppressive agents, and it occurred to me that it would be good to treat prostatic hypertrophy with it. And it was very good. It did shrink the prostate. It would have been a tremendous discovery, except at that time somebody discovered another compound which worked on it. And so this sort of fell into disrepute. But to my mind, it was a very important contribution, the fact that you could treat the prostate with this.
In 1997, you published the paper, The Role of Sex Steroids on Pathogenesis and Maintenance of Benign Prostatic Hyperplasia with A.C. Levine.
Would you repeat that
Yes.
again? Yes.
The Role of Sex Steroids and the Pathogenesis and Maintenance of Benign Prostatic Hyperplasia.
Well, when I got interested in the prostate, and this important discovery sort of dwindled down, we were interested in the prostate, and so we did these continued experiments to find out what caused hypertrophy and shrinkage of the prostate as part of our study of the prostate. Alice Levine, who had come to work with me as a fellow, was married to Alex Kirschenbaum, or really met Alex Kirschenbaum on this project, and they were married as a result of it. So that's another benefit of studying the prostate.
What about your work on polycystic ovaries? Would you comment on that?
Well, the polycystic ovaries is something I'm interested in now, and I think I just published a paper, Polycystic Ovary Unraveled, and I think I've delineated the main mechanism in polycystic ovary. 40 years ago, I published a paper, and I said that polycystic ovary must be related to aromatase. I'm trying to think what had drawn me to it. Oh, yeah, let me look at this. In 1964, I suggested that the pathophysiologic basis for polycystic ovary syndrome was a decreased conversion of androgen to estrogen. This view was based in large measure on the report of Short and London of an increased ratio of androstenedione to estradiol in the follicular fluid obtained from polycystic ovaries. Now, this was dismissed by everyone. It says fake.
Said what?
They don't believe it.
Oh.
But more recently, the other people, a fellow named Zeta from Greece, concluded that the sex hormone binding globulin and the CYP19 genes, that's the aromatase gene, may have a synergistic role in development of polycystic ovary. And he published another paper subsequently to what I published this commentary. And then somebody found that valproate, which they were treating for mental diseases, caused polycystic ovary syndrome. So I put this together. I had said that the polycystic ovary syndrome was a failure in aromatase, an abnormal ratio of testosterone estradiol. And these fellas, when they gave valproate, induced an abnormality in the testosterone estradiol ratio and produced polycystic ovaries. So I said, QED. And then I published this one paper. It's coming out, I think, today or tomorrow.
Oh.
So now other people...
That's polycystic ovary unraveled?
Yes. And then I got where's that? I got a letter from one of the big, Assis. Richard Assis. He's a big investigator in the polycystic ovary. He says, "Many thanks for your kindly sending me a copy of your commentary in Endocrine Practice. I sent there's a preprint. I agree that it is likely that aromatase defects play a role in this very heterogeneous disorder. We'll let you know of our genetic screens." So he says it plays a role, but I think it plays the biggest role. And there was an editorial to accompany this in Endocrine Practice, and the lady said, well, yes, it plays a role, but there's so many other things, but most of the other things indirectly related to aromatase. So I think I'm onto something really big here.
Oh.
And I had originally sent it to the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology, and Paul Ladenson wrote back, well, they had gone over it, but they didn't think it was significant enough to publish. So When I received that same day, I sent it off to endocrine practice. And the day they received it, they accepted it. That's right. If you look at the bottom of the paper, it says received that date, accepted the same day.
Now, why do you think the one journal accepted it the same day and the other journal thought it wasn't so significant?
I don't know what I think they're going to say, oops. And I don't know who he should have. He may have showed us somebody had interest in the prostate and didn't want to believe this. I don't know. I'm sure that had something to do with it. Of course, Paul Ladenson is a thyroid specialist. He doesn't know anything about the prostate.
You wrote a chapter, Drug Evaluation and Endocrinology, in Waif and Shapiro's The Clinical Trial, Clinical Evaluation of New Drugs.
Well, Sholem Waif asked me to write this chapter, so I wrote it. I didn't, it was this command performance.
Okay. You became chief of the Endocrine Clinic at Mount Sinai in 1972
Yes.
to 1985.
Yes.
You had risen from assistant attending physician in 52 to associate attending
That's
physician.
an interesting story. When Louis Sofa was supposed to retire at the age of 65, and Alex Gutman, the chief of medicine, said he was going to appoint me the chief. However, Solverson, who then succeeded Alex Gutman, had come to Mount Sinai, and he died suddenly. And so there was an acting chief. So Louis Sofa would manage to stay on for about 4 to 5 years beyond his scheduled retirement. So he was still the chief. And then when they appointed Fenton Schaffner, and Papa was the main director of the medical school, the appointment came up, and they wanted me to go full-time. But I said I couldn't afford to go full-time because I was doing well that way. I had 2 children in private schools, and so they then said, well, they had a meeting of the committee. The committee was of 3 people. Milton Menlowitz voted for me. Schaffner was, I think, for Papa. He voted for Dorothy Krieger. And Marvin Levitt figured, well, if I won't come full-time, he's going to vote for Dorothy Krieger. So they usurped the position from me, and as a consolation prize, they made me chief of the endocrine clinic.
How did you feel about all that?
Well, I was going to leave Mount Sinai, but Alex Gutman said, your place is here. Stay here. You'll do well. Forget about it. And he was right. I stayed there, and they've done very well with me. And my daughter has come there, too. She's the Holland professor of medicine, and maybe she'll win the Nobel Prize.
Well, I was going to ask you, but now's a good time. When did you get married?
Oh, I was married in 1946.
And how did you meet your wife?
I met her up in New Hampshire at a summer resort, Lake Tarleton Club.
And what was her background or career?
Well, she was at Goucher College, and she was still going to Goucher College, and then we courted each other, and then she left college and continued here, and we were married.
And you had children?
I have 2 children, 2 extraordinary children.
And one of them or both of them are in science and medicine?
No, my daughter, I told you, the oncologist, the Holland professor of medicine at Mount Sinai, and the other was a lawyer. She was chief of investigation in Robert Morgenthau's office, the New York City district attorney, till she became she didn't realize she had chronic fatigue syndrome. So she wasn't feeling up to this demanding job. So she taught law at NYU. And after a couple of years, the fatigue became so overwhelming that she resigned, and now she's starting to feel a little better and getting better. So that was her career.
What's her name?
Sandra Saltzman.
Okay. And your other daughter?
Dr. Janice Gabrilove.
And
she's married, but she keeps her maiden name.
And what kind of research is she doing now?
Well, she isolated granulocyte colony stimulating factor. What does, people who take chemotherapy, their white cells disappear. They get fever, infection, have to be hospitalized. This prevents it or minimizes it. So now millions of people are taking it. They must sell $1 billion worth of this medicine. Unfortunately, she discovered it at Memorial, which had a policy of giving the investigator very little. So she gets some royalties from him, but are not what she should have. She should have been a billionaire.
Wow. Now, how did she get to Mount Sinai?
Well, they knew of her reputation, and they offered her a job as chief of oncology.
Now, when you were chief of the endocrine clinic,
Yes.
What were your responsibilities there?
I supervised everything going on in the endocrine clinic, as well as I had responsibilities in the hospital too, as in endocrinology. So that I was the clinical endocrinologist there.
Now, you said Solverson died around this time. Did you work with him at all before he died?
Well, I knew Solverson. We were in Asia together, and we struck up a big friendship. Then he got the job at Mount Sinai, and he told me he was going to appoint me chief of endocrinology if he could get rid of Louis Silver. But he died before her.
What was Solverson like as an administrator and a leader?
Well, Solverson was a brilliant fellow, but very naive. He was protected by Raziello. People say bad things about Raziello, but in my personal opinion, she protected Sol while they all worked together, because he was easily diverted. People were very naive. People would take advantage of him. And then when he came to Sinai, he was unable to control the politics there. And then when he suddenly died. But he was a lovely person, Solverson.
And then you became acting director of the endocrine division in 1985.
Yes. But by that time, I was in my late 60s, so it was a little too late to appoint me the chief.
You were now you're the Florence and Theodore Baumritter Professor of Medicine.
Yes, I was appointed that in, what was it, 60-something, I forget.
1982?
1982, whenever it was, yes.
And how did that come about, that you got that endowed chair?
Well, Florence and Theodore Baumritter were patients of mine, and they wanted to endow a chair, and they said, I want you to sit in it. And so when they proposed it, they said to Tom Chalmers. Tom Chalmers said, oh, you're delighted to have a chair, but he had other ideas about it. So they said to him, well, you can do what you like, but we'll give the chair to Kalamazoo University instead. He said, oh, I didn't know that. So they let me sit in that chair. So I became the Baumritter professor.
You're going to be following this polycystic ovary syndrome.
Well, I'm publishing it now. I'm waiting to hear the reverberations, because all the people have been thinking polycystic ovary is related more to the diabetes feeding of the polycystic ovary. But that's a secondary phenomenon. The basic phenomenon, I think, is in aromatase, and I think it's very, very important. And since I published this, the original, 40 years ago, and now, if it comes true, it'll be a nice thing. It's good that I lived this long.
You were endowed with the Florence and Theodore Baumritt. You received an endowed chair in 1982.
Yes.
When did you retire?
Well, I didn't retire. I'm still working now. But the chair passed over around when I was in the mid-70s or so, that I became emeritus.
You didn't retire?
No, I didn't retire. I don't do very much, but I go in every day.
You do?
Yes.
What do you do? What's a day look like for you?
I come in, I sit at my office, I I wrote this paper, which I think is very important, and I teach. And so I fill my day, and especially since my wife died about 6 years ago, what am I going to do at home?
Do you see any patients?
No, I don't see patients anymore.
How did it come about that in 2007, the Endocrine division at Mount Sinai was renamed the Hilda and J. Lester Gabrilove, MD Division of Endocrinology, Diabetes, and Bone Disease?
Oh, the chief of medicine, Paul Klopman, said, "We want to name the division after you, Lester. We have to raise funds." So we went out and raised. I have one patient of mine, Robert Price, of Price Communications. He gave a substantial amount, and the others were raised from other patients or friends of mine, etc. They raised enough funds, and they named it. And they wanted to name after me. I said, I'd like it also named for my wife as well. So the Hilda J. Lester Gabrilove Division of Endocrinology.
How did you feel about that?
Oh, it felt very, very well. Especially since he suggested it. I didn't do anything about it. I did it, then I raised the money, but he suggested, so I felt this is a nice way to fill your career.
What's been the nature of your relationship with the Endocrine Society over the years?
Well, I've been a member of the Endocrine Society all of these years, and I was the local chairman when it was held in New York. And then more recently, I was on the history committee. So we're making history now.
What has the society meant to you in terms of a community?
Well, I've always been very interested and dedicated to the society and did whatever they called on me to do. And I've enjoyed my relationship all of these years. It's grown now. Now you go to the meeting now, you get lost. There are 8,000 people milling around. When I joined the society, it was a little society. You meet in a hotel. And then there was something called, what did we call it? The Laurentian Hormone Conference, where endocrinologists met up in the Laurentians. How many could they have? 100, maybe 150 people. And you'd meet there every summer. But that was ultimately abandoned. And now the Endocrine Society has gotten so gigantic. But there's a division in two of them. One of the basic scientists, and those are the physicians. So I think ultimately they're going to split it, because the dichotomy, I think, will be too much. Now, since then, there's been another association of clinical endocrinologists or something like that, and they've grown. They're about 5,000 or 6,000 doctors. So I think they'll split off, and they've associated themselves with the American Diabetes Association. And I think ultimately the Endocrine Society will get closer to them and perhaps split off the medical people from the basic scientists.
Now I'd like to ask you about your current views of the field.
What do you mean?
How do you, actually, before I ask that, I want to say, what are your plans for the meeting this year, or what have you done so far at the meeting this year?
Mostly attended and greeted what few friends I still have left in the society.
Has that worked for you? Have you met some?
I've seen some of them, but you can imagine if I'm 91, they have to be, well, there's some a little younger, but not many of them.
So I was going to ask you, what are your current views of the field of endocrinology? How do you feel about the developments in it? Maybe the...
Well, the developments will mostly be in the basic science. I always say endocrinologists are so smart that they've exhausted all of clinical endocrinology already, and the only fields are the basic science of endocrinology now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.